Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hello. Today is the 23rd of May, 2021, the 12th day of the month of Sivan, and today we're reading the Torah portion of Behalotcha. Hi, this is Leah Aharoni, and welcome to News from the Torah. So here in Israel, we just lived through 11 days of a war, and the ceasefire was signed on Friday. But this week, I would like to discuss the spiritual aftermath of this war and what we're supposed to take away from it. There's a famous saying, "What cannons fire, the muses are silent." But this is not how the Torah looks at it. In this week's Torah portion, the Jewish people are commanded to create two trumpets, hatzotzrot, from silver, which are sounded whenever a war starts. And these musical instruments have a special message that is especially important in time of war, but it is also important in time of peace. And today we will discuss the message of the hatzotzrot, of the trumpets. What do we need to take away from the war situation that just happened here in Israel? The war was not only against the Hamas in Gaza, it was also against Arab mobs inside Israel, the people with whom we Jews have been living in seeming peace for decades, who now decided to embrace the cause of the Hamas and announce from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Just for you to understand, from the river to the sea means from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which means there is no place left for the state of Israel in these people's mind. So this is another aftermath of this war we need to consider. And we will talk about the American Jewish community's response to this war, or more precisely about a new voice that is arising in the American Jewish community that is distancing itself from Israel, and what are the ramifications of that. And finally, we will meet Daniel Gordis and consider together with him, is it possible that peace will never come? And what would that mean for Israel? With a very interesting musical metaphor that Gordis brings. All of this right after the break. Stay tuned, don't go anywhere.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back. So, as we said in the introduction, this week's Torah portion has a specific commandment for the Jewish people to make trumpets that will be the call of war. The Torah says, "Make you two trumpets of silver, of beaten work shall thou make them, and they shall be unto you for the calling of the congregation and for causing the camps to set forth." So the trumpets had four purposes. They were there to announce war. They were there to announce the camps moving. They were there to announce Jewish holidays. And they were there to call the congregation to come together. So what is the message of the trumpets? And why do we need specifically silver trumpets to announce these occasions, and specifically, what is the connection between trumpets and war? The word trumpets, hatzotzrot, is related to the word hetzitzura, half a form. The Hasidic masters explain that everything in life, everything in this world is made out of substance and form. And the two trumpets, signify half a form. So what is war? Hasidic masters explain that war happens when people inhabit a fragmented physical existence. In Hasidic thinking, the entire world is constantly created by God every single second. Most people think that God created the world during Genesis, in the beginning of the Bible, in the beginning of existence, and then he sort of left it around to be, and he sometimes gets involved by moving pieces around. But this is not how Judaism sees the world's creation. God creates the world every single second anew, now and now and now and now. And God creates the world through utterances. This is what the Bible says, that God spoke and the world was created. So God obviously does not have a mouth. What does that mean? When do we speak? Speech is a way to communicate our wishes, our desires, our thoughts to other. So when we say of God having speech, or of God making utterances, it means that God desired to create the world for whatever reason, and he communicated that desire by creating the world. That's the significance of speech. This is how God spoke the world into being. He communicated to us that he wants it to continue to be, and he communicates it to us every second that he wants it to continue to be. So God's pronouncements are really holding the entire world together. And the Tanya, the seminal text of Hasidic thought, says that if God was to remove his pronouncements, the letters of his speech, from the universe would become null and void in one instant. But we do not have the ability to see this. We do not live in this state of consciousness. We live in a state of consciousness of a physical world that it is separate from God. And not only is it separate from God, but it is a physical world inhabited by distinct, separate people, plants, animals, phenomena. We do not see unity in this world. We do not see the world as an expression of one single system, one single will. And this is a fragmented outlook on reality. God gave us this outlook specifically in order for us to find him. This is our challenge, to look at the fragmented physical reality and see godliness in it. But when people perceive the world as fragmented and they see themselves as separate from each other, this is when war happens. When people do not cooperate, when they do not see each other as helpers, as partners, as co-creators of the existence, but they see each other as separate, as competitors. This is when war happens, and this is the point of Hatzotzrot, of these trumpets, reminding us that every time we fight over anything, we're not in a state of godly consciousness, but we're in a state of seeing separateness. And yes, sometimes we have to see separateness. When we're attacked, as Israel has been attacked by the Hamas, we have to defend ourselves, and we have to create a boundary for genocidal forces. There's also a commandment to defend ourselves in war against the nation of Amalek, which wanted to wipe out the Jewish people and the Jewish way of being, and God specifically commanded us to go into war against Amalek and to wipe it out. So the Torah is not pacifist, and the Torah does not tell us to sit quietly and let others hurt us. It specifically tells us to go out and wipe out anybody who attacks us, the Jewish people, or our way of being. But the Torah also tries to make us understand that in the end, war is a situation of a wrong outlook on the world. And when Jewish people have a complete godly outlook on the world, when they understand that the entire world is a representation of God, that we all live inside God, that God promises us that there will not be war, that we will not be affected by war. And it is said in the Talmud that during the times of the evil king Ahav, the Jewish people were idol worshippers, but they had peace among each other, and so they would win in wars. But during the times of David Melech, of David, although King David was righteous, the people were righteous, but they had infighting, and they would lose in wars. So this teaching is very often brought to show the importance of inner peace among Jews. But if you look closely at this teaching, in both scenarios, in both cases, people had to live through war. Yes, and sometimes they won and sometimes they lost, but in the end they still had to struggle with war. Why was that? Because they lived in fragmented reality. During the time of Ahav, there was internal peace between Jews, and people didn't speak badly of each other, but they were idol worshippers. They were still separate from God, and in that they lived in fragmented reality, and so they brought war onto themselves. And during the times of King David, yes, they were righteous towards God. They understood that God is here. They worshipped God, but they still lived in fragmented reality with each other. They had too much infighting, and that also brought war onto them. So the point of the Hatzotzrot is to come back to this God consciousness and to understand that the entire world is representation, is a space, is a domain of one God, and there's nothing fragmented about it. And if somebody is coming out against you, if somebody speaks badly about you, if somebody hurts you, obviously you're not allowed to let them hurt you. Obviously you have to put in a boundary, but you need to understand that this person is just showing his own deficiency, and he's showing us a deficiency that we probably have in ourselves. We're two parts in a fragmented reality, and if each one of us heals, there will not be a war, there will not be any struggle between us. The Hatzotzrot, the trumpets, have a different message as well. It is said by Hasidic masters that in this world there is God and there is the Jewish people. And both of these parts, both of these halves are incomplete, and they yearn for each other. It is hard to say that God is incomplete and that he's missing something, but it is as if he created us with a consciousness that he wants us to complete him. He wants us, the Jewish people, to complete him. How? By bringing his consciousness into the world, by being constantly aware of him and his reality. And this is why the trumpets were made out of silver. The Hebrew word silver, kesef, is the same root as the word for yearning, kesofim. You have money to bring into the world things that you yearn for. This is what you use silver for, precious metals, to create things that you yearn for. And this is why the trumpets were made out of silver. So how do we do that? How to create more God consciousness in the world? The trumpets were used on 3 other occasions besides announcing war: to bring people together, to announce that the camp is going to move, and to announce Jewish holidays. And this is significant because in Jewish thinking we have 3 layers or 3 parts of reality: place, time, and soul. So we are all always moving, and the camp of the Jewish people was always moving, and we're always moving from place to place. And every place is an opportunity to find godliness. We come to places and they're all missing something. And we come to a place that's missing something, it's God calling us to make that place whole, from half form to make it full form by filling the void through God consciousness. And the same is true of times. Jewish holidays are sanctified times, but every time, every space of time, every day, every week, every month has its own work. There's something missing in that time. There's something that needs to be done in that time. And by having that consciousness of, once again, missing parts, what is this time missing? What is the opportunity here? We have a possibility to make it whole. And the same is true of every soul, of every person we meet. Every person we meet has a need, is missing something, is maybe a little bit broken, needs healing. And with our actions towards other people, we can help them be whole. So this is our opportunity to understand that God is giving us millions and millions of opportunities to make broken half worlds whole, to see the world through the message of the trumpets, to announce God's presence in the world. Stay tuned.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with Love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with Love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back. So I think most people outside of Israel do not really understand the reality of life during war for Israelis. The mainstream media does not show you pictures of Israelis running to bomb shelters or of rockets being shot out of our skies by the miraculous Iron Dome systems, but then the debris is falling all over Israeli cities. And the mainstream media does not show you the suffering of Israelis while it shows you picture after picture of what goes on in Gaza and underscores the civilian deaths and the humanitarian toll to Gaza. What the media also doesn't tell you is that Israel takes amazing precautions to ensure that as few civilians are hurt and that the brunt of the military attack is really against the military installations of Hamas, which is an army just like any army that we're fighting against. So I thought I would share a few experiences that my own family had in the past couple of weeks and discuss that in light of how American Jewish community views this war and Israel in general. So one day on the eve of Shavuot, my 20-year-old daughter was about to leave home, and she came over to me and said, "Mom, if this is our last conversation, I don't want it to go this way. We've had some differences of opinion." And before she walked out was this sentence. She just broke my heart. My child leaving home to spend time with her friends, and what she's thinking is, what if this is our last conversation? On a different day, my 5-year-old daughter would not go to sleep. She was so scared of the rockets, she kept popping out of bed. We just had one rocket siren in Jerusalem, but my daughter was so scared I had to put her to sleep in our bomb shelter. On a different day, my husband and my son texted me that they're going to be late home from an errand they're running because the car right in front of them was firebombed and burned down completely. So they had to let me know that they were okay, but they would be late. And then my daughter, my married daughter, her husband, and my 1.5-year-old granddaughter were visiting us in Jerusalem. But when they had to drive back to northern Israel, they texted me that they were so lucky to have left late because the road to their community, this is inside Israel, was strewn with boulders and burning tires that had been thrown on cars that passed there just minutes before. And their friends' cars were hit with boulders by Arab Israelis rioting in support of Hamas. So these are just 4 experiences we have had in the past 2 weeks, and we are one average Israeli family, and our experiences are relatively mild compared to those of our friends and relatives in other parts of Israel, like my 75-year-old in-laws who have all of 45 seconds to run down 2 flights of stairs to their bomb shelter, and an elderly woman in a neighboring community found her death slipping in the rush down the stairs to the bomb shelter. Or like my nieces and nephews dealing with PTSD with as many as 100 rocket alerts a day. This is 100 times a day they have to run to the bomb shelter. Like our friends in the city of Lod 5 minutes away from the airport and 10 minutes out of Tel Aviv, holed up in their apartments, watching helplessly as their Arab neighbors, the people with whom they have lived in peace for decades, burn their cars, shoot and throw stones at their windows, break into their homes, destroy synagogues and schools, and beat up Jews who venture out into the streets. Can you imagine walking out to a street to be hit just because you're a Jew in the state of Israel? This is a pogrom. This is what we left the diaspora for it to happen in Israel? Now, 30 years of living in Israel have sort of helped me to work up the resilience to live through some of these scenarios. But here is something that happened this week that was completely unprepared for, and it took me by surprise, dismayed me. It made me feel betrayed. It was seeing and hearing so many of my American brothers and sisters, the people with whom I grew up in the United States, turn on Israel, on the Israeli people, and uphold the Palestinian cause, no questions asked. Nothing prepared me for comments unequivocally accusing Israel of genocide and apartheid in numerous Jewish Facebook groups, or the letter signed by over 100 rabbinical students in liberal rabbinical schools of the Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist movement, telling Israel it deserves the violence, while completely failing to mention any Israeli suffering. Or the demand by Jewish employees at Google that the company publicly call out Israel for militarized colonial violence, quote unquote, and terminate contracts with Israeli bodies, including the Israeli Defense Forces. So at first I felt really angry and violated. If American Jews were in harm's way, God forbid, Israelis would show up in a heartbeat to help them out. Israelis would not ask the American brothers and sisters questions of how this happened or take the time to analyze American Jewry involvement in various social issues and how they could have contributed to the problem. No, Israelis would show up, show support, and do whatever it takes to help diaspora Jewish communities. They always have, they always will do that. No questions asked, because this is what brothers and sisters do. They show up for their families. I understand that this is not how things work inside the American Jewish community. American Jews have a plurality of outlooks on the Middle East conflict, and they also want to be fair and impartial and uphold both sides. Okay, we can take that. I can understand this. But this does not justify embracing the Palestinian narrative hook, line, and sinker, or willfully ignoring facts which point to Hamas as the culprit of both Jewish and Palestinian suffering. It takes a special kind of blindness to dismiss the fact that Hamas is a terrorist organization calling for the genocide of all Jews, not just Israelis. It takes closing one's eyes not to notice that Hamas is performing a double war crime by firing over 4,000 rockets from within its own civilian population onto Israel's civilian population. It is prejudiced to dismiss Israel's right to defend her citizens, not acknowledge the efforts that the IDF has been making to take utmost care to preserve Palestinian lives, for warning civilians of upcoming strikes. And where exactly is the genocide when thousands of Israeli strikes on military installations inside Gaza have resulted in a very unfortunate death toll of about 60 Palestinian civilians? But do you know that 500 Hamas rockets fell short inside the Gaza Strip and killed over 20 of its own people? So who is exactly responsible for Palestinian suffering in Gaza? It's not Israel, it's Hamas. Hamas could have turned Gaza into Monaco. It has the sea It has billions of dollars in Iranian and Qatari and European support. But instead of investing this money into developing an amazing country for its people, it has taken the money for itself. It has invested the money into hundreds of thousands of rockets that is pointing at Israeli population, and it has demanded that Gazan children become slave laborers in building hundreds of kilometers, hundreds of miles of tunnels underneath Gaza in order to fight Israel. So instead of taking these resources and using it internally to create a country for its people, it has become a genocidal force focused on wiping out Israel. But somehow American Jewish people, some of them at least, do not see this. And somehow it is okay for 100 rabbinical students, the future leaders of the American Jewish community, the people who in a year or two will have a pulpit, who will preach, who will guide American Jewry, to think that this is okay and that the Israelis are responsible for the fact that Hamas wants to kill them. So I think it's a defense mechanism. With race relations and oppression narratives becoming the focal point of American social discourse, many American Jews are anxious to be on the quote-unquote right side, or maybe the left side, of political trends. They think that by distancing themselves from their Israeli brothers and sisters and vocally embracing the Palestinian racial narrative, they will affirm their allegiance to social justice. With Jewishness now classified as hyper-whiteness under the critical race theory, denouncing fellow Jews has become the ticket into the anti-racist club. This is a mirage. Anti-Semites on the right and on the left do not distinguish between Jews. Denouncing Israel for genocide and apartheid will only strengthen the anti-Jewish sentiment in America. The other day, when a group of Palestinians attacked diners at a Los Angeles restaurant, they chanted "Free Palestine" and "Death to Jews" all at once. They didn't ask the patrons about their political opinions. They punched Jews indiscriminately. So my shock and anger have given way to sadness and fear. Sadness for so many of my brothers and sisters who are cutting themselves off from our mutual relationship, and fear for the hate that they're bringing onto themselves in the process. A house divided against itself cannot stand, said Abraham Lincoln. I really hope more American Jews remember that before they throw Israel under the bus. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Bentako, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany is but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
Welcome back. So I don't usually read other people's materials on the show, but I really want to share something that Daniel Gordis, an Israeli writer and lecturer, wrote, because he's asking a very poignant question, and a question that I think is true. What would happen if Israel never reaches peace? And I want to read excerpts from a piece that he wrote last week. So here it is. One Memorial Day for Fallen Soldiers, Yom HaZikaron, a student of ours related a story about his army experience during the 2014 war with Hamas. He was part of a tank crew, he said, and they've been fighting for days. The crew was exhausted to the point that it wasn't safe. They were in touch with command, which directed them to a certain house in Gaza not that far away. The house has been quote-unquote purified. A rough translation of the Hebrew phrase used to mean that it was emptied of enemy combatants. Go to the house and sleep for a while, they were told. We'll radio you when it's time to get going again. When they entered the house, he told us, the ground floor has been destroyed. There was rubble wall to wall and nowhere to sleep. But they did see the remnants of Hamas flags, ammunition, and some Hamas literature. Whoever had destroyed the ground floor had fired at the right house. They went up a floor, but the situation was the same. Rubble everywhere, more ammunition, nowhere to sleep. So they went to the third floor, which was in perfect condition. In one room there were 2 twin beds. Stuffed animals were spread on the beds, and beneath the animals were sheets, comforters, and pillows bedecked with Disney characters. The room looked strikingly similar to the bedrooms of his nieces and nephews, they said. I looked at those beds, he told us, and I understood one day the children who had just fled that house and my children who are not yet born will battle each other on this very same battlefield. I can still see the room, hear the voices, see the faces of other students who are trying to breathe, struggling not to cry. And why would you not cry? Ask most people here. Get them at the right moment when they're prepared to be honest, and they'll tell you, this is never going to end. In recent hours, as the ceasefire that we all knew would come has set in, and so far seems to be holding, the worst is hopefully over. But even in our neighborhood, which was spared from rocket fire the entire time, it's been a long night. The muezzin from the local mosques blared their loudspeakers to the max, intentionally making it impossible to sleep. So I gave up and went downstairs to write this. From my window at this very moment, the sound of gunfire from a nearby village is peppering the early morning dark. A crowd is chanting away in Arabic. It's clear that the rage that these 2 weeks have sparked has not even begun to dissipate. Where might it lead is far from clear. Yet even in that is not clear, some things were clarified during these 2 awful weeks. Israel is resilient. Even in recent days, well into the second week of this war, Israelis were proving exceedingly resilient, even especially in the hardest hit communities. Hamas has triggered a sense of national Jewish unity we haven't experienced in a long time. On Hebrew social media, there were hundreds of comments from people in Ashdod and Ashkelon and towns even closer to the border who have been under relentless rocket attacks for more than 10 days, addressing Netanyahu. It's hard here, but we can hold out, don't stop, until you get the job done. But the IDF could not get the job done. It's not as simple as it sounds. It is lost on very few Israelis that after almost 2 weeks of heavy bombardment by one of the world's most powerful air forces, Hamas was still firing plenty of rockets. And now that the ceasefire has been signed, the predictable hand-wringing about who won has begun. The political divisiveness that had been set aside during the fighting erupted immediately with the talk of the ceasefire. The political right is savaging Netanyahu for having left Hamas intact and having caved to American pressure, while those on the left are arguing that Israel has once again lost the international battle for public opinion. The truth, though, is that we were never going to win either of those battles. The battle for public opinion, even or especially among young American Jews, is an important one, but may not be winnable. And Israel was never going to do more damage to Hamas than it did this time. That would have required a ground invasion for which no one here has the stomach. Dozens, hundreds of soldiers would have come back dead when it was over. Israel would be stuck with Gaza again, bringing us back to 2005. So who won? When Israel wakes up in a few hours, that won't be the major question in people's minds. But if you ask them, they'll tell you, not us. The only real question is how much time we bought ourselves. Army officials are saying that if we get 5 years of quiet, it will have been a success. After that, everyone knows we're going to do precisely the same thing again. And then again. Which brings us to the question above. What if there will never be peace? Last Shabbat, friends from the US stopped by before flying back home. Both of them exceedingly accomplished. He's a prominent leader in the American Jewish community who, like many of us, is no less worried about the battle that unfolds between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs than the battle with Gaza. Given that I'd written about how differently Jews and Arabs who are citizens of Israel see this country and this conflict, he asked how I thought we could fix it. I told him that I thought we could make it better. I wasn't sure that it could ever really be fixed. I could see on his face that he was horrified. Lay leaders in my country, he said, speak about an infrastructure of hope. Give Israeli Arabs enough hope, better employment, education, and the like, and it seems logical that they would want to be an integral part of Israeli society. But what if you're right? What if that can't happen? Where is the hope? Instinctively, I said to him, the hope is because of the violins and the oboes. He looked at me quizzically. So I explained. American Jews in the center and on the left tend to evaluate how well Israel is doing on the basis of its quote-unquote civil rights challenges, its conflicts with the Palestinians, the status of Israeli Arabs, and at the end of the day, that's pretty much what many think about when they think about Israel. But to think about Israel mostly in terms of those issues is to confuse the oboes and the violins. The winds are an important part of the orchestra. Take them away and you impoverish the music. It's less rich, less satisfying, less glorious. But more often than not, it's the violins that convey the melody. Take that out and you've got nothing. The purpose of Israel's creation was not peace. Peace, internal or external, is a critical goal, and internally it may well be a necessary condition for Israel's long-term survival. But Israel's purpose is not that. Israel's purpose is the flourishing of the Jewish people. What matters about Israel is not the conflicts, as critical as they are. What matters about Israel is why we're here. Walk around any neighborhood on a Shabbat afternoon. You will hear as much French as any other language. French Jews who recently watched as their courts decided not to prosecute a young Muslim who brutally murdered a Jewish woman in her apartment because he had smoked a joint before the murder and was thus supposedly not responsible for his actions. They can see the writing on the wall. But as they watch France become uninhabitable for Jews, and other countries will follow, the one question French Jews do not have to ask is the one Jews had to ask for centuries. Where will we go? Whether there will be anywhere who will take them in is no longer a concern. Whether countries will put immigration limits in place to keep Jews out is no longer an issue. For the first time in thousands of years, there's no Jew on the planet who does not have a place to go. That is Israel's purpose. Last week's celebration of Shavuot was hardly typical, but on a normal year, the night of Shavuot is the best night of the year to be in Jerusalem. It is customary for on Shavuot to stay awake until dawn studying. In Jerusalem, on the streets at 2 and 3 in the morning, there are typically thousands of people of all ages, secular and religious, learned and just beginning, scurrying from one class to another, one venue to another. Through the night, the sidewalks are packed. Witness an entire city come alive with Jews of all stripes embracing a tradition that they live in a myriad ways, all with access to those texts because they speak Hebrew, and you get a whiff of the Jewish vitality that's Israel's purpose. Go into an Israeli bookstore and check out the hundreds of linear feet of shelves filled with books written in a language that 150 years ago hardly anyone in the world spoke. In that miraculous revival of a dead language lies a sense of Israel's purpose. Jewish culture, literature, music, scholarship, art, and yes, even materials for Netflix is being produced by Israelis at a stunning rate. Only a tiny fraction of the literature is translated into English, so its development is hidden outside the state. None of the music is translated, and you can't translate art. You can convey what it means when an entire country lives its life according to the Jewish calendar, when it feels like you see the names of some of the exits on the highways correspond to places you know from the Bible. It takes nothing more than a mere exit sign to remind you, in a way more profound than most words can convey, that you are home. You are home in a way you can't be anywhere else. Think about Israel only through the lens of the conflict, and you've got oboes. Listen to the music of Jewish revival, flourishing, richness, and you hear the violins, the books and the highway exits, and the soldiers and the calendar, and the language, and the love of the land. It's all part of what it means to be home. These were 2 terrible weeks, and we have numerous challenges to face, more internally than externally, so we'll get to work. But as Israelis, whether as devastating as these weeks were, if it was all worth it, and you're here, it's the price we pay to be home. And it's the price we'll continue to pay if we have to, because this time we're home to stay. Have a great
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.